Okay, this lecture is over Module 7 of the curriculum. Its title is DHCP version 4. And we start out with why should I take this module? And it's to learn about DHCP version 4. Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol, of course. You should have discussed that probably in 111 and in Cisco 1. What will you learn in this module? We'll talk about the terminology and concepts of DHCP. We'll talk about how you can configure DHCP on a Cisco router, and then we'll talk about how you configure different types of DHCP clients. So starting with the concepts, Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol, as the name implies, is for automatic or dynamic configuration of IP information and other information on a end device, such as a PC. So you have a client and a server, and what's going to happen is when a client boots up, they're going to basically broadcast and say, hey, here's my MAC address. Does anybody know me and or is willing to give me some IP information? And then hopefully a DHCP server sees that and says, yes, I will give you information. Here's some information that you need. So that's basically the concept of DHCP. Again, it works in a client-server mode, and the reason we specifically put v4 on the end of the protocol is to imply that this is related to IP version 4. Basically, when the server gives out an IP to a client, that client has a lease on it, and that lease is the amount of time that they can continue to use that IP address before they either relinquish it or, more likely than not, ask to continue using it. So DHCP is a 4-step process. A lot of times it's shown on one diagram like this with an axis or an indication that time is flowing this way. So here they do it one step at a time. So as I said, the client or end device going, hey, here's my MAC address. Will somebody give me information? The technical name for that is a DHCP request. So typically this happens when a machine is powered on. And again, hopefully this is seen by a DHCP server, which then turns around and does an offer. It basically says, hey, I'm a DHCP server. I would like to offer you this address to use. The client will then turn around and say, hey, that IP address that you offered me, yes, I would like to request that IP address. And then there is an acknowledgement of the server saying, okay, you're good, you can use that. So I don't know of any situation when a client would be offered an IP address and it would turn around and say, no, I don't want that, or I don't like that. But anyway, that's the 4-step DHCP, or the 4-way handshake for DHCP. Now then, like I said, part of the information that's supplied by the DHCP server is the lease time. You can use this for a day. You can use this for 7 days. You can use this for 30 days. However, the server is configured, and we'll see that configuration later in this module. But when that time expires, if the PC would like to continue using that IP address, which is very, very common, 99 point something % chance that that's what's going to happen time after time, you basically just repeat the last 2 steps that we discussed in obtaining a lease. So what happens is the client will do a DHCP request, hey, I would like to use this IP address. and then the server turns around and says, okay, you can continue using that address, basically. So that's the process to renew a lease. 715 is a check your understanding on DHCP version 4 concepts. You can do that on your own to make sure you understand the information. And we'll move on to 7.2, which is configuring a Cisco iOS DHCP version 4 server. So in the Cisco world, if a DHCP server is going to run on a router, as is shown here. So we have two networks, 10.0, 11.0, and we have a DNS server running over here at 192.168.11.6. So the steps, the first one may seem kind of weird, but the first thing you do is you exclude addresses that you do not want the DHCP server to give out. And you do that with the IP DHCP exclude address. And you can give either an address or a low address and a high address, which would specify a range. Now, why would we want to do this? Early on, we talked about maybe assigning ranges like, you know, .1 to .10 is networking equipment, maybe .40 to .50 is servers, .30 to .40 within a network is printers, things like that. So those are things that might have hard-coded IP addresses, and you don't want your DHCP server giving those addresses out to end devices or addresses in those ranges, because you've kind of defined what you want those ranges to be. The next thing you do is you can give the pool a pool name. So, you know, you might call it, you know, end user devices or PCs or DHCP pool 1 or something like that. So you can give it a name. And then once you've given it the name, step 3 is configure the DHCP version 4 pool, which actually has a number of things that you might want to do. So you want to define the address pool, so that'll be a network number and a subnet mask or prefix length. You will want to define the default router. You want to define a DNS server name or address that you're going to give out to your DHCP clients. You're going to want to define what domain is this pool for. Then you want to define the leases either in days, hours, minutes, or you can say infinite. You know, once you give it out, you don't get it back. On a established network that is functioning correctly, doing the infinite is probably okay. But if you're kind of first setting this up and doing things, you probably want to go with a much smaller lease time. And what I've seen in practice is 1 day or 7 days, I would say, is probably the most common. And then if you're still using old Windows NetBIOS, you might want to define a couple of Wins servers for your Windows machines to use. So here's a configuration example. I think this is the same topology or pretty close to what we had before. So we log into the router. We exclude 10.1 and 10.9 for some reason. We also exclude 10.254. We define the pool name, which in this case they defined it as LAN pool 1. This is for 10.0 /24 subnet mask. We tell where the default router is, and then we define the DNS server. and then the domain name is example.com. So that is how we go through and on this router configure DHCP. Now, to configure that, to verify that DHCP version 4 is configured correctly, we can show the running config and ask for the whole DHCP section and look over that. We can show IP DHCP bindings, and we're going to see examples of all these in an upcoming section. Basically what this will do, will show you all the IP addresses that have been given out and the MAC address of the device to which that IP was assigned. And then we can do server statistics that tells how many clients we have, how many requests, how many offers, a whole bunch of statistics. And again, like I said, we'll see some of this output in a section or two. To verify that DHCP is working correctly, what we can do is we can go in and verify the DHCP configuration. So this is the first one, show running configuration. What we care about is only the DHCP section. So here's our excludes, here's our name of our pool, here's the network information, the default gateway, the DNS server, and the domain name. So we can just make sure all those are configured and make sense. Then also on the router, we can verify DHCP version 4 bindings with the show IP DHCP binding command. And in this case, we only have one address that has been given out. It was 10.10. It was given out to the machine that has this MAC address. This MAC address. And then this is when the lease is going to expire, and what interface it saw this client on that it gave it. So you can go through and do that. The next thing we can do is look at the statistics. It tells us how much memory we're using. In this case, we now have 2 bindings, 1 address pool. We've seen 4 discovers, 2 requests have been made, etc. So we can see that the DHCP server is doing something. And then on the PC, we can verify whether or not it's working by using the IP config/all and seeing that yes, we do have a MAC address, we have a subnet mask. We obtained a lease on the 14th, it expires on the 15th, so we had a 1-day lease. Here's the default gateway, here's the IP address of the DHCP server, and here's the IP address of the DNS servers. So again, this is on the PC, and you can make sure that that all kind of makes sense. 726 is a syntax checker on configuring DHCP version 4. You can do that on your own. The next section talks about what if we want to disable and no longer have this be a DHCP server. And what we can do is we can say no service DHCP, and then if we want to turn it back on, we can re-enable it with the service command. So this disables it until we turn it back on. The next section talks about DHCP version 4 relay. So first we need to talk about the topology and kind of what the issue is. So we have a topology where on this side of the router we have a switch, a PC, a DNS server, and the DHCP server. And over on this switch we're showing one PC that's trying to get its IP address. So basically what happens is this PC will not have an IP address because, as I mentioned in 7.1, the DHCP process is the PC broadcasting, hey, here's my MAC address. Does anybody know who I am? And in the last module, or maybe the module before that, we talked about the fact that routers segment broadcast domains. So this DHCP version 4 request by default is only going to be seen by devices that are on this G000 interface. So that request will never make it to the DHCP version 4 server. Now, related to that, presumably the person has gotten on and is not communicating, possibly did an IP config/all, and saw that they had no IP address. So the first thing they may want to do is try to release and renew the IP address. So when they release it, there is no IP configuration existing on the machine. When they go through and try to renew it, it's going to make that DHCP request, and it's not going to see a DHCP server, so it's going to tell you you can't do that. So hopefully then you realize what the problem is, that you have a router between the end device and the DHCP server. So what we can do is we can go into the interface G000 for the network that we're having issues with, or we anticipate issues with, and say IP helper address 11.6. So the helper address is the DHCP version 4 server. So what happens now is when this PC will presumably keep requesting or looking for an IP address. When we do this helper address, it can now communicate with the DHCP version 4. So now when we show IP interface G000, notice that it has an IP address, a broadcast address, and it specifically now says there's a helper address of 11.6. So that's confirming that we have the helper address on this interface. Now if we go to the PC and do an IP config/all, sure enough, we have a domain name, we have an IP address, we have a subnet mask, and we have a default gateway. And those of you that have had me for 111 or for Cisco 1 know that I harp on this, and I always tell them that if I harp on this, that means that's a really good question for an exam. But one thing that hopefully you're familiar with is if you're asked what are the 3 pieces of information that a device has to have configured to be able to talk with another device on the internet, capital I, the correct answer is an IP address, a subnet mask, and a default gateway. Okay. We talked about the helper address and relaying in the context of DHCP, but when we do that IP helper address, there are actually a number of services that are broadcast based, that are relayed. NTP, which is time, excuse me, TACX, which is authentication, DNS, which is domain name service, DHCP or BootP, server or client, are relayed. Trivial FTP is relayed, and Windows NetBIOS. Again, a little older protocol, but that is relayed as well. So these are other protocols that would have the exact same issue we discussed, again, because routers segment broadcast domain. 7210 is a packet tracer on configuring DHCP version 4. So watch for that to appear in Blackboard. And we'll move on to 7.3, which is configuring a DHCP client. So they discuss, I think, 3 types of clients you might have. So you might have a router as a DHCP client. So basically what they're showing here is this is your small office, home office, and you have a router, and that router is connected to a cable or a DSL or some type of modem, and you're getting your service through your ISP, and your ISP possibly on a router, possibly on a Linux server or Windows server, but here they're showing it on a router, has DHCP running. So when your router comes online, G00/1 would be configured to request an IP address using DHCP. It would make the request, your ISP would see that, and provide you back with your public IP addressing information and possibly other information for your home router. So here we log into our Soho, our home router, and we go to interface G0/0/1. We say IP address, and instead of giving an IP address and a subnet mask, we say DHCP, and then we issue the no shutdown command, and then it tells us that the interface came up and was assigned an IP address, tells us the IP address it was assigned, and the subnet mask, and then the host name, which is another thing that you can provide via DHCP server. Here they're just going back and saying show interface IP interface G001, and it's giving you the IP address, the broadcast address, telling you that the address was determined or configured by DHCP, and that the interface is up and the line protocol is up. So we have an IP address and we are functioning correctly. You can have a home router. So here, this was a small or home office where you had an actual Cisco router as the DHCP client. Here you have like your Linksys router or whatever type of router, Motorola, that you might have, and you've gone into the router through a web interface. You've gone to setup, and it asks what connection type you have, and you say automatic configuration DHCP. So that means configure this router just like before from the ISP. 734 is a syntax checker on configuring a Cisco router as a DHCP client, so you can do that on your own. And we'll move to the module practice and quiz. So we start out with a packet tracer on implementing DHCP version 4. I will be assigning that, so watch for that to appear in Blackboard soon. The next thing we have is 724 is a lab with the exact same name, so this is a physical equipment version of the packet tracer I just assigned. I will not be assigning this lab at all, or maybe in the future I'll come back and assign it on the net lab. So we may or may not do this lab in the future. As far as what did you learn in this module, you can go through and read this and make sure you understand everything we talked about. This was a pretty short module. And then finally we have the module quiz, which of course you can do on your own to make sure you understood information from the entire module. And that finishes up Module 7.